You know how we always think about our identity, our sense of self as, well, a story we tell ourselves. But what if it's something more physical? Something more like an architecture that can be put under strain, that needs support, and yeah, that can even break. That's what we're digging into today. A totally new way to look at who we are.
We've all been there, right? That feeling of being stretched so thin, where just one more little thing feels like it could bring everything crashing down. We call it burnout, and usually we blame ourselves. But what if the problem isn't about a lack of willpower? What if it's actually a flaw in the very structure of your identity?
Look, psychology has done a fantastic job of explaining the content of who we are. You know, the beliefs we have, the groups we feel a part of, but it's been a little fuzzy on the mechanics. How does our sense of self actually hold together from one day to the next, especially when things get really, really stressful?
And that leads us to what this new framework, Story Collaboration Identity Theory, we'll just call it SIT, calls the maintenance gap. It's trying to solve a huge puzzle. Why do people who seem so strong, so on top of everything, sometimes just collapse? And why is getting back on your feet so much harder than just thinking positively? SIT thinks it has an answer.
Okay, so let's get right to the core of it. This theory, SCIT, is pushing for a major shift in thinking. It wants us to stop seeing our identity as just a narrative floating around in our heads and start seeing it as a real, functional, load-bearing structure.
Now, I know that sounds super academic and complicated, but the key part is dynamically maintained. All it really means is that your identity isn't some static thing you have. No, it's an active process. It's an equilibrium that you are constantly actively working to keep up.
And this right here really puts that shift in perspective. The old way of thinking is all about the content. What's your story? This new view is all about capacity. How much stress can your structure actually handle? It's a huge change, from thinking like a psychologist to thinking more like a physicist.
So, if identity is a structure, what is it built from? Well, the theory has a name for it, narrative fascia. And honestly, the best way to think about it is like the connective tissue in your own body. It's this flexible, tough material that weaves everything together and holds all the different parts of you in one coherent system.
So, we have the building material. Great. Now let's talk about the forces that are constantly acting on it. This is where we really get into what you could call the physics of the self.
The first big force is called interpretive load. Just think of this as the total weight your identity has to carry around every single day. Every bit of uncertainty, every new role you take on, becoming a parent, starting a new job, all of it adds to this load. It's the constant stress that your structure has to put up with.
But, and this is absolutely crucial, you don't carry that load alone. The theory calls this collaborative load bearing, and what it means is that your support system, your friends, your family, your workplace, they act like pillars and beams in your architecture. They literally help you distribute that weight.
So this relationship is everything. The more reliable and stable your external support network is, the less internal energy you have to burn just keeping yourself together. Strong supports mean a low maintenance cost, but weak or unreliable supports, well, that means you're left carrying way more of that load all by yourself.
And this completely reframes how we think about resilience. It's suggesting that resilience isn't some kind of magical inner strength or grit that you either have or you don't. No, it's an architectural property. It's a direct result of how well designed and how well supported your identity structure is.
Okay, so this brings us to the pretty obvious next question. What happens when the load gets to be too much for the architecture to handle? What does failure actually look like in this model?
The theory redefines burnout in a pretty radical way. It's not just about feeling tired or unmotivated. Systemic burnout is what happens when that narrative fascia we talked about gets stretched beyond its limit. Think about bending a piece of metal. It doesn't just snap back into place, right? It's permanently altered. That's burnout. A permanent change in your ability to carry a load.
And this brings us right back to that puzzle from the very beginning. If this model is right, it should be able to explain why the people who seem to be the strongest are sometimes the ones who break the most dramatically. And guess what? It does.
It's something called the high capability paradox. See, really capable people are often amazing at managing huge amounts of load. They look incredibly stable from the outside, but that stability comes at a huge cost. They're basically operating at the absolute edge of their max capacity with no slack in the system at all. So when a new, unexpected stress comes along, there's nowhere to go. The result isn't a little crack, it's a sudden, total failure.
And let's be really clear about this. This kind of collapse isn't a crisis of faith.
It's not about you changing your mind or losing your beliefs. It is a mechanical failure. Your beliefs can be exactly the same as they were yesterday, but the structure that was holding them all up has broken.
A really common trigger for this is something called a sudden load transfer. So imagine you lose a key piece of your support system, maybe a job, maybe a core relationship. The load that person or institution was helping you carry doesn't just vanish into thin air. Nope, it gets transferred directly back onto you all at once. And if that sudden new weight is too heavy, it can completely overwhelm your system in an instant.
Okay, so we get the architecture, and we get how it can fail. And I know, that might sound a little bleak, but the most powerful part of this theory is what it tells us next. Because if your identity is a structure, that means you can learn to be its architect.
And the principles are actually pretty straightforward. First, you've got to assess your load. Get honest about what the biggest sources of stress in your life really are. Second, you have to map your supports. Who and what is actually helping you carry all that weight? And third, you have to actively strengthen those connections, because the link between you and your supports is often the first thing to start fraying.
So if you take one thing away from all of this, let it be this. Stop thinking of resilience as some personal virtue you just need to dig down and find. Start thinking of it as a design challenge. Your ability to withstand pressure is a direct result of the quality and the maintenance of your support system.
And that leaves us with one last big question to chew on. For maybe too long, we've acted like we're just residents living inside our own identity, just putting up with its flaws. But this model gives us a different option. It gives us the tools, and maybe the responsibility, to become the architect. So, the question is, what are you going to build?